Okay, guys, this is part two. I'm gonna try to keep my voice a little bit quieter so that some people complained last time about my voice is actually blaring. So I did listen to it; it was pretty loud. Okay, so we're gonna finish up part two of the European Exploration and Conquest. So give me a second so I can start this up right here. We stopped at this, the last one we actually stopped at American Vespucci. As I mentioned, American Vespucci, this is the reason we end up getting the name of America. And the fact that, America Vespucci, it was actually a map maker that was traveling with him that labeled it on the map as America, naming it after his good friend America Vespucci. Continuing on with this, I think I pretty well covered that. Okay, we have Balboa. I don't really care if you necessarily have to know Vasco Nunez de Balboa, but as long as you know Balboa, I'll be happy. Okay, he crosses the Isthmus of Panama. Most of you should know exactly where Panama is at, or the Isthmus of Panama, excuse me, is. You should also know where Panama is since you had geography already. Okay, when he crosses it, okay, the key thing to remember about him is the fact is that he calls the what we call today the Pacific Ocean, he names it the South Sea. Later on, somebody else changes that, and again, like I said in my other video, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on a lot of these explorers because of the fact that you guys are going to do a little bit of a research project and come up with some things for yourselves, so that I don't give you all the great information, all the fun, and ruin the surprises for you. Okay, one of the key things about Magellan that you definitely want to remember. Remember we talked about, if you look at the top of this slide, it says Ferdinand Magellan and the first circumnavigation of the world. Okay, what I did not put down there, and you should make sure that you understand that, is Ferdinand Magellan. It does not say Ferdinand Magellan, the first to circumnavigate the world or the globe. Okay, and this is because, again, this is interpretational, again, that first rule of history being that history is interpretive, okay? Because of the fact that Magellan does not complete the voyage. Remember what I think I told you in one class, was that, Magellan, excuse me, okay, when he leaves Europe and goes, wow, I totally messed this up. Let me start again, okay? When he leaves Spain, I was just going to say Europe. When he leaves Spain, okay, he goes through, this is known as the Strait of Magellan, because another strait that he gets named after himself. He takes it all the way to the Philippines. He actually dies in the Philippines. And again, I'm not going to create a major spoiler alert because you guys are going to be doing some research on this information. And I don't want to give you just all tons of information in which you can just, put into your paper because I want you to do the research. But some of the key things I do want you to know. Number one, is that Magellan does not finish the voyage. He dies in the Philippines. The one that actually does finish the voyage is one of his first mates that actually, Elcano, he actually finishes the voyage. And that last leg of the voyage of which Elcano makes is from the Philippines all the way back up to Spain. Okay, so again, the concept of being interpretation of history, should Magellan be given credit for being the first to circumnavigate the globe? As you will read in probably in a lot of history books, and there's a lot of resources online that say they claim that he's the first. Again, to understand that's interpretive, okay? Because of the fact, some people would make the argument he didn't finish the voyage, so therefore he shouldn't be given the credit. And others will make the argument it was his expedition, it was his ships that did finish the voyage, and he was the one that was commissioned to do this. So therefore, he should be given the credit. Again, first rule of history: history is interpretive. Okay, I'm trying not to go really fast, but I do need to kind of get this done as quickly as possible, and so that you use it as a review as well. Okay, remember the key things. 1519, you should know the year. He leaves with 5 ships. He goes from Atlantic to South America, Spain across to Atlantic, South America, straight through the Strait of Magellan. Well, I really cannot speak this morning. Okay, and remember, he's the one that also renames the South Sea. He ends up renaming it to the Pacific. And for some reason or another, the name Pacific Ocean sticks instead of South Sea. And I already mentioned about Elcano, so we're going to move on. Okay, now as I mentioned in class, remember all the things that had to line up. You have the Crusades, which generated a greater interest in different cultures and people and things that were going on. You have the improvement of shipbuilding. You have the improvement of map making. You have also the sextant. You have the compass. You have all these inventions that, and again, this is like kind of like the stars lining up. But the reality is that once this begins, it becomes a major floodgate. Now, remember, as we mentioned when we talked about Columbus, that Columbus makes the argument about the geometric trip being the straightest point from the quickest point from A to B is a straight line. Of course, in this landmass is slapped right here, and once the explorers began, they flooded. I mean, they literally flooded. And as you can see on this map, I mean, there's you have Columbus's trips, you have Gilbert, you have Cartier, you have Cabot, and I'm just naming a couple that are on here, and of course Vespucci, without a doubt, and Ponce de Leon. So you should know a couple of the people on this map, and the key thing that all these people have in common, there's actually two things. One, yes, they're looking for the fabled El Dorado or the City of Gold. Okay, they're looking for the gold and the riches and the special gems. Remember that mercantilism is driving this whole thing, especially with the first characteristic of mercantilism, that being a country's wealth is based upon how much of hard money that it possesses, gold, silver, and precious jewels. Okay, so that is driving it. And another thing that is also driving this is once it is realized that that this is not the Indies, okay, which Columbus was originally seeking, that this is a whole new landmass. Well, then the question becomes now, okay, what's on the other side? And as we said, with Magellan, with Coronado, and Cabrillo, we know there's another side to this continent, and you're not going to be in the Indies either. So the question then becomes, okay, we're going to look for a really quick northwest passage. So that's another theme that comes up in this during the Atlantic explorations, is that the seeking of a northwest passage, some way to get through this big landmass quickly and easily. And many were convinced that there had to be a direct water route that would go straight across somewhere, someone to come across, instead of having to go all the way around South America to get around. There's no way to get through the Central America region, not until much later. So that becomes a major theme as well. So we'll discuss that later. Okay, the first conquest. We're going to talk about the three big ones, civilizations that exist, are the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incans. And we're going to really focus on the Aztecs and the Incans for right now. Later on in U.S. history and stuff, we kind of do speak about the Mayan civilizations and their influence within the whole Central America region, Mexico, and also with the Native American cultures. We kind of cover a whole Native American cultural thing in the very beginning of the APUSH history. Okay, so I'm going to kind of stick with just these two. One of the things that students always have a problem with is trying to remember between who conquered whom, and trying to keep those separated. So I have a little trick that I always tell students. Okay, to remember that Cortez is the one that actually conquers the Aztecs, is Atlantic City. Just remember Atlantic City, Atlantic City, Atlantic City. Even if you don't know, just remember Atlantic City. The Atlantic is being the Aztecs. The A of Atlantic is the Aztecs right here. And the C, it stands for Cortez, Atlantic City, Cortez. Okay, so if you remember when you were talking about the explorers, you remember the phrase Atlantic City. It'll help you remember, okay, the Aztecs were conquered by Cortez. Okay, just got to remember those two. Okay, so Cortez, and I'm just going to give you kind of a brief history of Cortez. Cortez actually is a Spaniard, conquistador. It's just one of the people that you're probably going to do research on. So I'm not going to give you a whole lot of information here, but I'm going to give you the brief information. Okay, so Cortez actually arrives in Mexico, and he literally marches his forces into um, Montezuma's reign, the Aztecs city, and I cannot say that city, so I'm not even going to try, because it's not really important for this lecture anyway. But anyway, the Aztecs actually believe Cortez is a god. He comes in. They believe it's fulfilling a prophecy. They don't originally try to stop him. They reverence him as a god. And they quickly find out. Now, Cortez's men are appalled by what they find as far as their practices, their culture, the human sacrifices that were being done in the name of their god, in honor of their gods. And this really appalls the good Christian Catholic believing conquistadors. Now, even though the Aztecs is a major civilization, without a doubt, it's a phenomenal civilization. It matches or compares to as great as the Egyptian empires, the pyramids and all this stuff, and it matches on a scale as well, or if not more, to some degree, as far as the empires that existed in Europe. Now, of course, they don't have the technology and other things and advancements of which the Europeans have, but as far as being a civilization, they're definitely considered civilization, even though this Cortez and his followers do not consider it so. They do label these people as heathens, as barbarians, savages, people that need to be Christianized. And we're going to talk about the cycle of colonization in a few minutes, but understand that it quickly goes bad for the Aztecs. Montezuma is eventually killed. Cortez actually easily steps in and almost makes himself as a ruler. He demands, at one point the Aztecs are able to repel them when things start going really bad, and Cortez is forced to retreat and run away. But he does actually end up creating allies with several other tribes and that lived in the region, and they go back and they actually do conquer, completely destroy the Aztecs. As a matter of fact, they literally burn it to the ground and destroy everything. But do notice that in this painting that there's this nice little beautiful lady that's standing directly behind Cortez as he sits on his quote-unquote throne. She's actually Cortez's mistress, I guess you could say, a nice way of putting it. And from all the writings and stuff, which was hard to depict, but for the most part, that they were a nice couple, I guess you could say. But she's a translator. She's from another tribe. She knows the language. He does use her for that purpose, and it does somewhat anger originally some of his own men. But one of the key points about this whole thing is that the concept of how the Spaniards began to assimilate into or assimilate with the Native Americans, and this was actually done intentionally to deplete any chances of rebellion against, by assimilation, meaning intermarriage. They kind of encourage that later on, but that's not to depict or downplay the horrors that took place. And again, that's a lot of information, which in a whole separate course that we can go into. Okay, and the other person is that you need to know for this class is the conquering of the Incans. Okay, the Incas. Okay, not I always said Incans. Okay, is Pizarro. Pizarro is the one that conquers the Incas. Now, here's a good way to remember this one. There's ink in my pizza. Ink in my pizza. Okay, that's pretty easy to remember. Okay, ink as being the Incas, and Pizarro, the pizza being Pizarro. Another way so we can keep track between the Cortez and Pizarro. Okay, very almost exact similar thing. Pizarro is their technology-wise, they totally outpower the Incas and manipulate them, again, consider them as being heathens and barbarians and savages and so forth and so forth. If you also notice too, when we talked about earlier this year, we talked about the requiremento. Okay, this is in this painting, this little document, it's right down in here. The very concept of the right to conquer to some degree. It's the justification of conquering. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Okay, if you look at this drawing, this is one reason I like to use in this drawing. These are the drawings and stuff that are being sent back to the old world or back to Europe, back to Spain. And if you look at the, and Portugal actually, because this is a Brazilian sugar mill. If you look at the workers and stuff, I mean, there's no way in the world, if you look at this very closely, that you would ever conceive, if you did not know the horrors that took place. If you did not know that, if you're looking at this picture, you would think that these are just people working on a farm, on a sugar mill. I mean, everybody's working. Nobody looks like they're being tortured. There's no slave master, whipping them or forcing them to do anything. They look somewhat happy. I mean, if you look at the faces on a couple of individuals, I mean, this guy, definitely doesn't look like he's depressed or being oppressed. Similar to this guy as well, this one as well. Okay, they all just look like they're happily working, and now, or even, and they're not suffering from disease, and everything's just wonderful. Everything's just great. Again, this is a form of justification. Okay. It portrays everything as going well. Everything's lovely. There's nothing wrong here. There's nothing to see here. And again, like I said, whenever evil does exist, you have to find some way to justify the evil, at least to others, so that others don't think you're just a horrible, horrible person. Okay, I'm going to speed through this one because for some reason it's doing this, and I don't know why I did that, but so I fixed this. Okay, all right. So we had the cycle of conquest. First, you should know this cycle. There's a big hint for you. You should know this cycle. Okay, first you have the explorers that show up. Okay, like Columbus and others. Okay, followed by, once the explorers find the land, usually that immediately is followed by conquistadors, or the conquerors, so to speak, the soldiers, the ones that are going to, in a nice way, put the people into submission to some degree, I guess you would say. There's no way, a nice way of putting that. And usually with the conquistadors, or soon following the conquistadors, will be the missionaries, because the reports will come back about how these people were heathens and how they were barbarians and how they need to be Christianized, okay, and to show them the light and bring them into line with the rest of the world's beliefs, I guess, to sort of a large degree, especially with the Christians. Okay, so followed by that, usually there's the permanent settlers that will come. Remember, one of the characteristics of mercantilism is that the captive market concept of the colonies being established. And to establish the colony, you must have permanent settlers who are there that are officially running the colony, exploiting it for whatever they need to exploit it, and to benefit the mother country. So you should know this, the cycle of conquest. Okay. Again, another key concept that you need to know, you should be able to read a graph or a chart or a bar graph at various times that can show up on a test. And you may have various questions that go with that. Now, this is a chart. This graph is a very easy one to do. If I were to, ask you what was the peak period of the gold and silver from Spanish America, of course, the answer to that would be what? Yeah, 1596 to 1600. And, in the 1516 to 1520 is when it's just really getting kicked off. So it's very small. And remember that this is millions of pesos, okay, and not dollars, okay. Okay, slave trade, unfortunately, this becomes a major theme. And unfortunately, it becomes one of the most horrible of all things. One of the key reasons, remember, the Native Americans, as Columbus arrived, quickly began dying off. So enslaving the Native Americans wasn't really an effective way of getting workers and laborers as you begin to develop this area. Biggest reason being, one, they are familiar with the land. They have allies in the area they could escape to. But the biggest thing is, remember, is that the bioterrorism to some degree. The concept that disease is brought over. and within the first 100 years, you have almost 90% of the Native Americans are dying from diseases. Okay, the measles, the mumps, the typhoid, and all that wonderful smallpox, a big one too. But also, I do want you to pay attention to this one. There's another misconception that originally the slaves were all being shipped to the United States. What becomes the United States is actually not the United States at the time. So, but most of them into the North America region is only 5%. Most of all the slaves, or the majority of the slaves, are being sent over into the West Indies. The West Indies were considered to be a seasoning ground. You had a lot of sugar plantations and rice plantations that existed in this area. And eventually, and this is we study this extensively in my A Push class that you guys will be coming to next year. We talk extensively about how the colonies, especially the British colonies, began to pull from the West Indies, slaves from the West Indies, until it becomes self-sufficient within its own of itself. Okay, so you shouldn't be able to talk about the Gold Coast region and how the slaves were being brought in, and should have some idea at least about these three figures. 35%, the slaves were being sent into Brazil. About 60% of them are all going to the West Indies, and about 5% or so are being sent up to the into North America region. Okay. Now, one thing is the slave trade existed in Africa before coming to the Europeans. Slavery is not a new concept. The Europeans did not initiate slavery, and it wasn't introduced just because of the introduction of the New World. That had nothing to do with it. Slavery of itself had existed through the annals of time. There is a big difference, though. The slave trade, or the slavery of the concept of slave and trading slaves, actually existed a long time ago. One of the biggest, there's somebody rolling that thing right outside my room. Okay, slavery actually existed as far as the right of the conqueror. If you conquer someone, you had the right to enslave them. Now, slaves in the world history aspect, long before North America becomes, or in the colonies, or into the West Indies, it's not a race issue. It has nothing to do with race. It's just the right of the conqueror. So it existed long before the Europeans ever showing up, even in Africa. Portuguese actually began to replace European slaves, which they did have at the time, with Africans. It became easier to manipulate them. You had such a diverse disparity of languages, so you could actually get slaves from different regions. And by the same token, in that way, they would be able to not communicate with one another, much easier to control. So that was an important concept as well. But they're actually being used for the sugar cane and the sugar plantations. I know this doesn't sound nice, but they were able to handle the hardships better, or at least the perception was that they were able to handle the hardships better. The first boatload of African slaves brought up by the Spanish takes place in 1518. 275,000 enslaved Africans are exported to other countries, and this quickly begins to escalate as they begin to trade into. Remember the map that I showed you on the Columbian Exchange? You had the trinkets, you had the guns, you had rum that was being traded. And now these were Africans that were actually enslaving other tribes which they had captured. But that's how it initially starts. But then eventually the Europeans will actually begin to go into Africa and raid the villages themselves, especially when the stories began to play out what was actually taking place. And a very key point, guys, is between the 16, that little C right here, guys, is a century. So just make sure to note of that. If you want to write it out as century, on your notes, that's fine. I just put the C so I don't have to write out century. Okay, between the 16th century and the 19th century, you have over 10 million African that are shipped to the Americas, and that is an astronomical number. I mean, and you have to remember, a lot of these people do not make it alive. Now, I wanted to key point as well. If you have something on a test or something in the 16th century, we're talking about the 1500s. Okay, 19th century, we're talking about the 1800s. Okay, remember the century number is always one above which the year that you were the years that you were talking about, and the decades that you were talking about. Okay, because you live in the 21st century, but it's what, 2013. See how that works? It's really easy. But a lot of people, a lot of students on essays will make the mistake of turning around and saying the 16th century, and then they say 1659 or 1619 or something like that, and they're completely wrong. So you can't mix those two up, and try to. That's just a key point. Okay, the slave ships, the Middle Passages. Okay, the slave trade, as I said, once it kicks off big time. There's a lot of money to be made on this. So when the slave ships show up, they actually begin just compacting them as much as they can. They begin to lay the slaves out in what was known as the coffin position. They would be stripped naked. They would be chained together, and they would be chained to the floor of the ship. Each one would be tagged from the regions of which they came from or where they were taken from, as you can see on their picture here, this depiction. This was actually a drawing of to show slave ship captains of how to efficiently pack their slaves to get the most slaves in the space that was provided or that they would have available on their ship. Okay, no way to sugarcoat this. This was horrendous. This was horrible. It wasn't like, hey, I got to go to the bathroom. Can I get up and go to the bathroom? Nothing. It's just horrendous, and it's just a terrible thing. Okay, captive slaves. Okay, if the rebellion did, and it did happen at times, the slaves would wiggle their way out of the chains that they were hooked to, or rebellion would take place, or if the disease would break out, whatever the case would be. They were brought, if there was a small rebellion began to get, they would bring up everyone that was involved or even suspected to be involved for the large part, because most of the time the slave traders had no clue of the language that they were speaking. So it's purely by speculation of who was in, or suspicion of who was involved. And then they would just throw them overboard, especially those who were sick. And one of the key things that a writer once wrote, that you could always tell which of the ships on the sea, if you saw another ship, which one had slaves on it, which one was a slave ship, because the sharks always followed the slave ships. Okay, European empires in the Americas. This map just kind of shows you the concept. Later on we talk about England, and England we haven't really discussed because we'll talk about them later. But England gets started much later than Spain and Portugal do. So this map just kind of shows you, we have the small, you have some Dutch up here and some English. And again, like I said, I'm not going into the English and the Dutch and all those, but the main concept is to pay attention to is the Spanish and the Portuguese. Okay, the areas of which they go. Now this chart, be sure you know this chart, guys, because it is the colonial class system of how the colonial class system is established, and who's at the top and who's at the bottom. So you should be able to explain each one of these. The main fact is that the Native Americans are at the very bottom, and your black slaves are at the very bottoms. Now remember, you should know what mulattoes are. It's the Spanish mix. Okay, so you should know each one of these. Know this chart so that you can repeat this chart to me, and should be able to explain to some degree which each one of these are. Okay, so I'm going to move on to that one. Okay, administration of the Spanish Empire into the New World. You have the Ecomedia. I've always bad words. Okay, basically it's the forced labor. It's controlled by the Council of Indies. You have a viceroy that's put in place. The viceroys were located in what was known as New Spain, as you look back at the other map I just showed you, and Peru. So you would have people that were actually put in charge of the controlling the colonies as well. And all this is also done by papal agreement. Now, papal agreement basically means that the church is also in control. The church is having a major say. And when you think about what the things that were taking place, again, the justification, they're heathens, I'm not going through all of that word list I went into before, but that's important to understand that the church is also sponsoring a lot of this and actually having a lot of say in the control of these colonies. Now, I brought this picture up because I really want you to look at this. Look at the imagery, and these are actually drawings that made at the time. The foot into the chest, it's just that whole concept of complete control. Here you have a friar, okay, or no, excuse me, I was the wrong one. You have the overseer here. This is actually being placed in stocks. The spots on these people, you probably already know, is the smallpox. The concept of the guy with the smallpox riding on the horse, which is a pretty bad drawing of a horse, by the way. But anyway, and the concept, he's holding a musket. The Native American has been infected with the smallpox, is being sent out to the rest of the tribes. Okay, and without doubt, the Catholic Church has a major influence, and we see the influence all over in Mexico, which is, even to this day is primarily Catholic. And what is, currently, Florida, New Mexico, Nevada, even California to a large degree. So the Spanish missions, okay, remember we talked about the concept of the entire Catholic and the missionaries coming in the cycle of conquest. Now, as I think I mentioned this guy in class on Columbus Day, I talked about this guy, De la Casa. He actually originally isn't a priest. He actually originally supports slavery and promotes the concept of bringing Africans into the West Indies as a form of labor force. But he quickly begins to see how horrible they're being treated. And I can't even begin to go into all the stuff that were taking place with the treatment of these people. So he actually becomes a priest, and for the next 50 years, he actually creates what's called the New Laws, established in 1542, of inhumane treatment of the slaves that were being brought into the African Americans. And he actually, for 50 years of his life, after he becomes a priest, he champions for equality, even maybe shipping of them back to their homelands. So he becomes a major advocate of civil rights to a large degree. I mean, anybody that really should be celebrated, I mean, it's this guy. I mean, yes, he does have a checkered past as far as the way he started off, but, he sees the errors of the ways and he spends 50 years of his life trying to correct that error. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful, okay? Colonial rivals, okay, you have Portugal, ends up, really lacking the numbers to dominate trade within the Indian Ocean. They never gain hold as a powerful hold as Spain does, and of course, and later on, India. Spain consolidates holdings all the way into the Philippines. The first English expedition, as I mentioned, they're kind of late. You remember Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492. Talking well over 100 years later, the English began their expeditions into the Indies in about 1591. So they're kind of a late comer to get into it. And so were the Dutch. The Dutch arrived in India in 1595. So they're really slowly getting started. But those are some reasons behind that, and we'll look at that when we look at England, when we do our study of England. Okay, just a map of the colonial rivals. As I said, man, talking about a major floodgate. All this concept of the once the exploration period begins, it literally booms. And remember, key concept. Remember what's driving this. It is actually the concept of mercantilism, the whole economic system, mercantilism. Now, do notice that the slave trade, you should be able to explain. The slave trade, the triangle trade. You had manufacturers that were sending items, really cheap items and stuff down into Africa that they would sell and trade. They would get the slaves. They would send them over to the Americas. The Americas provided what? Yeah, that's right. Raw materials. Okay, raw materials. Okay, cheap labor and raw materials. Remember that whole circle we had showed. And the manufacturers, and they manufacture stuff in America, maybe make stuff, and they actually send it. Excuse me. They send the raw materials back to England. Back to Europe. Okay, this concept not just England, it's Spain, Portugal as well, and then they send the manufactured goods all the way back to the colonies and to their colonies in America and sell. Okay, I'm trying to speed this up. Okay, impact of European expansion. Okay, you have the Arabic populations. They become ravaged by the disease. You have the influx of gold, especially a silver, which creates an inflationary economic climate. Okay, also known as the price revolution. New products introduced across the continents. Remember the Columbian Exchange. You should be able to name those things and to be able to explain how they had an effect, and with the bioterrorism as well. And all this collectively ends up deepening, the colonial rivalries between the countries, and this does play out because it end up creating some wars. Okay, last but not least, this is just kind of the patterns of world trade, and just kind of familiarize yourself with some of the areas, like with the fur, the fish, the timber, where they're located at. You should be able to implement this information into an essay and everything. Okay, that's going to conclude our part 2 of the European exploration and conquest, or colonization, I should say. Okay, so that's going to be it, and I'm going to finish this up, and we'll wait for the next one. Have a good day.